And this has the pointer, right? Built in. Oh, sorry. Whoops. What happened? Oh, there's that thing where I black it out if it's lower left. I have to stay away from the lower left. And okay, good. And then for the pointer, it's this. Great. And is there like a lie? Let's see, this works. Good. And I don't have, just have a few reference notes. And okay. And then, so this sounds all right. Okay. Can everybody hear me okay? I'm not starting yet, but it's sound check. Louder? Okay. Will do. Okay. Testing 1, 2, 3. Now you can hear me better? Okay, good. And if at any point my voice starts fading, or if I start talking too fast or you can't understand, just let me know. It's happened. How many people do it? Online 30? I think we can start. Or, okay. Okay, I think we can start. It's 2:01. 2:01 by my watch. It sounds like I'm not as loud as I was before. Is this still okay? People in the back? Is it? Okay. So welcome everybody who has come out on a rainy afternoon, and hello to all of you who are listening online to one of two orientation or introductory lectures to the exhibition Raphael, the Power of Renaissance Imagery. So we're titling this lecture Raphael and the Tapestries, the series being called the Dresden Tapestries. And the second part will be given a week from today on August 3rd by Carol Genschap, the curator at large. And I will be talking about the actual tapestries that are the focal point of the exhibition, but the theme of the exhibition is actually the impact of Raphael and Renaissance imagery, the impact of the tapestries. And so there are many more works of art that were influenced by or impacted by the tapestries than the 6 tapestries themselves that I will focus on. So Carol Genschap will have a lot to talk about a week from today, but still just covering the 6 tapestries themselves is quite a task. And I should start out by saying that this is an exhibition that would not have been possible without generous loans, not only of the tapestries, but of related works by the Gemäldegalerie Alte Meister, or the Old Masters Picture Gallery of Dresden, that is part of the Dresden State Art Collection, the Staatliche Kunstsammlung in Dresden. And I'll be abbreviating in some of the captions for the slides. You'll see GAM, Gemäldegalerie Alte Meister. I made some typos a couple of times and I put GMA, like Good Morning America, but it's GAM, Gemäldegalerie Alte Meister. And then SKD is for the State Art Collection. And there is a catalog that accompanies this exhibition in English. There's both a German and an English catalog. And it's available in the museum shop, but it's very complete. It has a lot of scholarly information and beautiful color illustrations of all the tapestries in the exhibition and the cartoons and related works. And this exhibition is not exactly the same as an exhibition held in 2020, but very similar in Dresden that I'll explain in a minute. But just to give you an idea about what I'll be talking about, after background on the exhibition, a little information or overview of Raphael, the artist, I'll be talking about in a little more detail each of the individual 6 tapestries in the exhibition, and I'll conclude with other programs and events during the run of the exhibition, which goes until October 30th. So the way I remember the dates is that it opened the day after Bastille Day, July 15th, and it closes the day before Halloween, October 30th. So if you're ever in doubt when it closes, just remember, get here before Halloween. Now, so these are 3 of the 6 tapestries that I'll be talking about that, again, are the focal points of the exhibition, and then the impact of the cartoons and tapestries. And I'll explain all that, what the cartoons are in relation to the tapestries, et cetera. That is the thematic heart of the exhibition. And so we have the tapestries exhibited with the works in the same gallery as the works that were influenced by them. For example, this wall of works on paper and paintings. We also have sculpture and ceramics. So here's a good example of a tapestry, Paul preaching in Athens, and a print that is a copy of the composition of the tapestry that dates to about the same time as the tapestry, as well as a ceramic plate from the Renaissance period, just created just a few decades after the tapestries were completed, with this ceramic technique called maiolica ware that is prevalent in Renaissance ceramics. And then the one of the paintings that takes certain elements of the composition, but where the subject matter is entirely different, but yet the influence and the motifs, the poses of the figures, the background elements, et cetera, are definitely derived from this particular tapestry. And this is one of the galleries in that great museum that lent us the works, the Old Masters Picture Gallery in Dresden, one of Europe's most impressive and just incredible museums, just in terms of its permanent collection, whose roots go back to the at least 16th century. And one of the jewels in the crown of their permanent collection is this masterpiece by Raphael, the Sistine Madonna, that never leaves the walls of the Gemäldegalerie. So I've tried to be conscientious about signaling which works that I'm illustrating in my slide talk that are not in the exhibition. And this is a destination painting. Sometimes it's called the Mona Lisa of Germany because it's so famous and people travel from all points to see the Sistine Madonna in the Dresden Museum. And I'll talk about the Madonnas of Raphael and how they figure into his work in a few minutes. And perhaps it's less, it's even more famous for the two little mischievous looking cupids or puttae at the foot of the composition on the bottom that are endlessly reproduced on coffee mugs and T-shirts and posters and so on. I think you can even find some of that paraphernalia in our museum shop. And then again, emphasizing the fact that this is a version of the exhibition that debuted in Dresden in the summer of 2020. Its opening date was delayed because of COVID, as was ours. I think it's a small miracle. We sometimes think of it, the staff, and I think of it that it is here and it has opened, given all the obstacles. And this was the third set of dates that were planned for the exhibition. And in addition to the very generous loans of the tapestries and the majority of other works in the exhibition from the Dresden Museum, we also have loans from premier museums in the United States and European institutions as well. So we have quite a few works from the National Gallery in Washington, the Met in New York, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and a beautiful painting from the Museum of Dartmouth in Hanover, New Hampshire, the Hood Museum, and then European museums have lent as well, the Albertina in Vienna and Museum in Weimar. And the exchange and relationship between Dresden and Columbus has been longstanding and robust, having in part to do with the fact that we're sister cities with Dresden. And as early as 1999, some of you may remember an exhibition called Dresden in the Age of Splendor and Enlightenment that consisted of 18th century paintings from the permanent collection. But more recently, there was an exhibition that was built around one particular loan from the Dresden Museum, Titian's Lady in White. We called the exhibition A Renaissance Mystery. You may remember that from 2018. And as we speak, it's still up in Dresden. If you're wondering where our Hopper painting, Morning Sun, is, it's in Dresden in an exhibition, a special installation, an exhibition that's called the Edward Hopper Inner and Outer World. So it's accompanied by studies and preparatory works for that painting and works from the permanent collection of Dresden from different eras, Renaissance, Baroque, that have the theme of a woman in an interior or a figure and a window. And so that show is running until July 31st. So it's almost going to close. In fact, our courier, one of our registrars, is getting ready to bring back the painting when the exhibition closes to accompany the painting on its trip back to Columbus. So the layout of the exhibition, let me ask, how many people have already seen the exhibition? Okay, and how great, and how many have not yet seen the exhibition but are planning to? Okay, good. So for those of you who've seen it, you realize that the first gallery looks like this, and the layout does have to do with the tapestries. I already explained related works, smaller works on paper and paintings. And in two instances, we have the paintings by Raphael that were used as guides for the weavers in creating the tapestries, the so-called cartoons. And in two cases, in the opening gallery, the cartoon accompanying the miraculous draft of fishes is reproduced in photographic, as a photo reproduction, very high quality. So that happens twice in the exhibition. Otherwise, we do have reproductions of the cartoons much smaller, but accompanying the labels of the various tapestries. So this is one of the 6 tapestries. And here's a better view of the cartoon. And a cartoon, we often think of it as comic strips or comic books or animated cartoons, but it actually comes from the cartoon in this context from the word for paper or cardboard. And it has to do with the fact that these studies or these guides for the tapestries were, these monumental paintings were done on paper, on many smaller sheets of paper pasted together. And then Raphael and his studio assistants, Raphael did the design of the compositions, and some of the execution we think was done by assistants as well as by the hand of Raphael. And they were created in a medium called gouache, which is essentially, it's very similar to watercolor with animal glue added to the paint, which allows the artist to work faster, cover broader areas more quickly, and it dries quickly. And the cartoons are, as you see, a mirror image of the tapestries, which is, and I'll show some illustrations, is because the way the tapestries were woven, the cartoons were put below the looms that the weavers worked on. And they worked from the back. And so when the tapestry was completed and was lifted up, it would be in reverse of the cartoons. And then the reason that we have these tapestries, the reason that the cartoons were created was because of a commission from Pope Leo X around 1515, when Raphael was ordered to produce a set of cartoons that were to be woven into tapestries. The weaving of the first set of tapestries based on the cartoons and others that followed, the weaving was done in Brussels, but the so-called Vatican tapestries that are normally shown in the Vatican museums within the Vatican complex and are only on rare occasions shown in the Sistine Chapel. These tapestries were, they were woven in Brussels, and they were commissioned by the Pope to hang on the walls underneath sets of paintings by earlier Renaissance artists. And again, meant to hang and be displayed in the Sistine Chapel on special occasions like Christmas and Easter. This photograph was taken in 2020, which was the 500th anniversary of Raphael's death, which is essentially the reason for the timing of the exhibition in Dresden and here. And there were a lot of other exhibitions, both in Europe and the United States. In fact, there's one still running in the National Gallery of London that closes on July 31st, commemorating a couple years late because of COVID, but commemorating the 500th anniversary of the artist's death. And one of the reasons that they were commissioned by the Pope was to reinforce the authority and the power of the Pope. And the Sistine ceiling had already been painted by Michelangelo. It was completed a few years earlier. And then these, that was finished in 1512, the ceiling paintings. The end wall of the Last Judgment was done in the 1530s, decades later. But it was a real honor for Raphael to be able to have works that were displayed in this very important part of the Vatican complex. The tapestries that are in our exhibition that have been in Dresden since the 18th century were not woven in Brussels, but rather woven in England, in London, or there's every reason to believe that they were woven in London. In a tapestry, we call it, it's a kind of an archaic word, a manufactory. The Mortlake Tapestry Manufactory, sometimes it's called the Mortlake Tapestry Works, which was founded in the early 17th century in an area that in the 17th century was outside city limits of London. Now it's within London on the west side of the city, although the factory itself closed in the early 18th century. But the weavings were done in the 17th century in this tapestry works, this tapestry manufactory that was opened through the sponsorship of King Charles I, of whom we have a portrait in the exhibition by Anthony van Dyck, as well as a portrait of his wife, Henrietta of France, is some of the many ancillary works in the exhibition that Carol Genscheft will be talking about in more detail. But at any rate, it was Charles that not only was, he oversaw the opening of this tapestry factory, but he bought the cartoons that were used for the Vatican tapestries that had been circulating in Europe in various places. And he acquired them, brought them to London in 1623, and then started having tapestry sets woven after them. There were 7 surviving cartoons out of an original, we think an original 10. And so what happened to the other 3 tapestries is not, or the 3 cartoons isn't clear. And so the dating of the tapestries upstairs in our galleries is said to be after 1625. And then they were acquired. The reason that they're in Dresden is because this ruler, this Prince Augustus the Strong, he had a number of titles. He was an elector. He was, it was called the Elector of Saxony. That's the area, the region of Germany of which Dresden is the capital. And that's where he had his court, in Dresden, within the region of Saxony. So he was an elector, which is a kind of prince. And he was also King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania. So he wore many hats or many crowns. And one reason that it was important, important for him to have the tapestry set in Dresden, he leapt at the chance when he realized it was available, was because as King of Poland, he had to convert to Catholicism. And these tapestries would reinforce his credentials as a Catholic and as a Roman Catholic and King of Poland. And we have this portrait in the exhibition of, his name is Augustus the Strong. He's Augustus II, Augustus the Strong, he was known as. And we also have a bust of him, a bust in sculpture of both of these, of the king and of Augustus the Strong. So I was talking about how the cartoons had a kind of circuitous route, and we do have a map in the exhibition that explains how the cartoons were produced by Raphael in Rome. The Vatican tapestries and other sets were woven in Brussels. Then we lose track of the cartoons, but they end up, are discovered, it is said, by Rubens in the early 17th century in Genoa. And he alerts the British monarch, Charles I, that these cartoons are available. So they travel from Genoa to London, and that's where they are today. And then the cartoons, as I said, or the tapestries were produced from the cartoons in London, and they were in the 18th century, they were found to be in a collection, a private collection in Paris. There were several owners, or they passed through several hands, the tapestries, before ending up in the hands of Jacob Heinrich von Fleming, whose portrait is on this label next to the map. And it is this gentleman who offered the tapestries to Augustus the Strong. So from London to Paris to Dresden by 1723. Or they ended up in Dresden in 1728. They were in the hands of this Heinrich von Fleming for 5 years. 5 plus 3 is 8. Yeah, 1723. And then, as I said, these cartoons did end up in London in the Royal Collection, and they are beautifully installed, reinstalled, again, for the 500th anniversary of Raphael's death. I believe the gallery in which they were exhibited before, I saw them just before they were taken down and restored and reinstalled. So I only know this through photographs, how beautiful this looks. And they are in the Victoria and Albert Museum. They were in a couple, they were in at least one other location before coming to the Victoria and Albert Museum in 1865. And in theory, they're still part of the royal collection. So when they're identified, or when the repository, the place where they reside, is identified, it should say on loan from Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, because the generosity of the royal family of Queen Elizabeth permits them to be viewed by the public in this public institution. So how are they woven? They were woven on a loom called a low warp loom. So this is a flat loom, like a table, and the threads were suspended in the warp threads were vertically aligned in relationship to the person that would do the weaving, the weft weaving, the horizontal wool and silk colored threads that were woven through the warp. And this is a print from the 18th century that shows the way that the tapestries were created, even though the weaving of our tapestry set was done in the 17th century. But this is as close an approximation as we can get. There were teams of weavers sitting at these low horizontal looms side by side. And it's estimated that for each tapestry, it took 5 weavers 8 months to produce each of the tapestries. And I'll talk a little bit in more detail in a few minutes, but the set in the Vatican was woven with gold thread versus simple silk and wool that the Dresden and most other sets were woven from. So that sets them apart. And there are still weavers that work in one of the institutions where a tapestry set resides, a decorative arts museum in Paris, the Mobilier National. And this is a photograph of someone who's weaving a contemporary or a tapestry based on a contemporary design from the in the same fashion as the Dresden tapestries. And I should also note, going back, that the cartoons were, and it sounds alarming, but the cartoons that are so beautifully installed in the Victoria and Albert Museum that we have the reproductions of in our exhibition were sliced into vertical strips. And so that each of the weavers that worked on the various tapestries would have a strip that they would use as guides and outlines. We believe that it was outlines, not the actual strips of the cartoons were placed under the looms, but that the actual strips of the original cartoons were available for the individual weavers to look at to make sure that they were matching the color and the details of the design correctly. They would also use mirrors so that even though they were weaving from the back and they were doing the tapestry in reverse, in effect, they could use mirrors to put underneath the weaving to see what, and they could peek underneath the threads to see what the the orientation of the tapestry would look like before it came off the loom. And then we do have a film, and these are stills that were taken from a beautiful video that was produced by the Victoria and Albert Museum. And if you've been in the installation, you'll see that there's a QR code and also a URL, a web address where you can get a really effective, beautifully done video that shows the whole process from cartoon to weaving of the tapestries. And what I've tried to explain will become much clearer in case there's any confusion there. And it was produced, as I said, by the Victoria and Albert Museum with a film company called Stroma in 2021. So I highly recommend that. Then, as far as Raphael, his birthplace, the place where he grew up, was a smaller but very culturally rich Italian city of Urbino to the east of Florence. Born in the 15th century in 1483, so his life spans the late 15th and early 16th centuries, but he is one of the 3 primary, most important high Renaissance painters, along with Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. And he quickly outstripped the abilities of his distinguished teacher, or it's unclear whether it was actually a student-teacher relationship or whether he worked in the studio of Perugino, an early Renaissance master. And he establishes quickly his independent style. And by the age of 21, he moves to Florence. And after 1504, he's painting Madonnas in his mature independent style that become very widely recognized and prized. He painted many, many Madonnas and children. And this one is a prime example. It's not in the exhibition. This one, the very famous Madonna della Sedia in a tondo around, painted on a round surface, is in the exhibition by way of a painted copy that was done sometime, we believe, in the 18th century or sometime before the 1720s. And so you can tell from these works just the beauty of Raphael's art and style, the idealized compositions, both the figures and the landscapes shown to perfection, a great deal of monumentality and dignity with which he shows his figures, and compositions that show a perfect harmony and balance. And in the tapestry cartoons, these are all those, each cartoon has a story to tell, a narrative. And he was particularly skilled in the clarity and the directness and the economy of means that he uses in telling the stories pictorially in these tapestries with this idealized monumental style. Oh, and then he's called to Rome by the predecessor of Leo X, who commissioned the cartoons, Julius II, the Pope who commissioned the Sistine ceiling paintings by Michelangelo. And it was Julius II, the elderly Pope, who would die not very long afterwards, who commissioned Raphael to do his very famous works in the Vatican preceding the tapestries, which are the rooms in the papal chamber called the Stanza della Segnatura, the room of the signatures. That's a kind of study, library, ceremonial, a room used for the ceremonial signing of documents. And he was commissioned to paint on the four walls of the chamber the four branches of learning, according to the 16th century, which were philosophy, poetry, and there was law and religion on the other two walls that you can't see. But his most famous of these works is the School of Athens, which is often so surprising when you think that within the Vatican, the holiest of holy places in the Christian Roman Catholic world, you have a scene of pagan non-Christian philosophers. But there was a way that these very humanistic leaning Renaissance popes and prelates were able to reconcile the classical pre-Christian world with Christianity and Roman Catholicism. And so here, again, the way that the tapestries were designed to hang under the previous the row of paintings done by earlier Renaissance artists. And by the way, this is by Perugino, the so-called teacher of Raphael. And the influence or the importance of these tapestries, as I said, in asserting the power of the Pope and the authority, papal authority, was of supreme importance. And Raphael was working on these murals, these frescoes in the Stanza della Segnatura at the same time that Michelangelo was painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And it's believed that Raphael saw Michelangelo at work, etc. So it must have been gratifying to Raphael to realize that after this very famous work in this very important part of the Vatican, that he was asked to contribute and to have his work shown in this space as well, in a different form, in the form of tapestries, which were very highly prized and ranked on par with painting in terms of prestige of various art forms. And it should also be mentioned that Raphael had a personality that was, he was sometimes called the Prince of Painters. He was handsome, he had social graces, he was well-liked, He was successful. He was rich. He was a ladies' man. And so he lived what you might say, call it a charmed life. And he defies the stereotype. I think last time I was on this stage talking about the artist that was the focus of a special exhibition, it was Van Gogh, whose whole life is defined by unhappiness and misery and lack of success during his lifetime. Raphael, just the opposite. And but it's not all happy. Very tragically, he died at the age of 37. And this painting, The Transfiguration, not in the exhibition, is his final masterpiece that is considered not entirely finished. And even though that is not in the exhibition, it is in a form, in a painting that we do show towards the conclusion of the exhibition, where the theme is the cult of Raphael and the deep admiration that succeeding generations had upon Raphael, and how he was elevated, reached more or less a pinnacle in the 19th century, when not only the style of his paintings was emulated, but his life was depicted in paintings like our work by the French neoclassical artist Ingres, that is in the final gallery of the exhibition, showing him with his most famous and beloved lovers, the baker's daughter, known as the Fornarina. And there are many versions of this painting. We have one of them. And then on the easel behind is the Transfiguration. There's a portrait of the Fornarina on the right, and then lurking in the shadows, presumably angry, is Michelangelo, who's the rival of Raphael and didn't have the happy life that Raphael had. But Michelangelo lived a lot longer. So Raphael dies in 1520, and Michelangelo lives decades and decades longer. As I said, the Last Judgment on the end wall of the Sistine ceiling wasn't completed until 1541, and Michelangelo lives longer than that. So these tapestries are sometimes called the Acts of the Apostles tapestries, because the sources of most of the subjects come from the fifth book of the New Testament, the Acts of the Apostles, which are about the missionary work, in part about the missionary work of Peter and Paul, or speaking in Catholic terms, St. Peter and St. Paul. And the books of the New Testament are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the different accounts of the life of Christ, followed by Acts of the Apostles, what happened in terms of the missionary work and the spreading of the religion of Christianity through the known world. And 2 of the 6 tapestries that we have in the exhibition are not from the Acts of the Apostles. So it's just me, but I kind of avoid using that term because the miraculous draught of fishes, for example, comes from the book of Luke. And then the subject of Christ's charge to St. Peter is based on 2 biblical passages that are not from the Acts, but everything else is, and that really is the focal point, are the Acts of Peter and Paul. And the reason I have one tapestry subject, which is a 7th in blue in brackets, is because we don't have that tapestry, and neither does Dresden, but we still have some works related to it, which I'll explain in a few minutes. And so here are 3 of the tapestries in the first, or one, again, the tapestry in the first gallery, the miraculous draught of fishes with the cartoon that I already showed, and another work that's very interesting that is based on the cartoon. So here, the subject is the recruitment of St. Peter, who was a fisherman, Simon Peter, fishing along with his brother Andrew. And he was asked by Christ to come and follow him, follow me and be a fisher of men. And meanwhile, in another boat, two other men who would become apostles, John and James, were treated with a miraculous, bountiful catch of fishes that was a miracle of Christ that helped further his cause of enlisting them to also become disciples. So in one fell swoop, he gets 4 disciples in these fishing boats on the Sea of Galilee. And the interesting painting that's the same size as the cartoon, a life-size copy of the cartoon, comes from a private collection in the Columbus area that we did not find out about until we were well into planning the exhibition, and we were very excited about. And it's believed to come from or have been painted in Genoa in the 17th century, very possibly by a Flemish artist. And it's very close to the cartoon and the tapestry, with some interesting variations that when you see the work, or maybe you'll see it again if you've already been in the show, you can pick out the differences. For example, the waters are rocky and there's a lot of wave activity, rough waters, I should say, compared to the more placid waters. The cranes are in different positions, and there's different vegetation in the lower left. The background is slightly different. So there are all kinds of interesting variations to study. And I have the word no halos because the Vatican tapestries show all of the holy figures with halos, Christ and the apostles. And the English tapestries do not show halos, we believe, because of the adherence of Charles I to the Church of England, the Anglican Church, or the Church of England, which was not Catholic, pointedly not Catholic. Thus, the trappings and conventions of the Catholic art, like halos on holy figures, were not included in the tapestries. And also exhibited in this first gallery is a statue from, and there are a number of classical statues that are reproductions in Dresden from ancient classical statues that influenced Raphael. Raphael was the supervisor of excavations and placements of antiquities, of objects from the ancient world that were excavated in Rome. And so he would have known about this ancient statue of it's an allegory or personification of the river Tiber that runs through Rome. And it influenced this figure, the father of John and James, in the boat on the left-hand side of the tapestry. And the excavation of this work, the date of it was 1512, just a few years before Raphael began work on the tapestries. And then I should also point out that the cranes are considered to be a symbol of the Pope, a symbol of the Pope's vigilance and watchfulness, because according to legend, the cranes would fall asleep on one leg, the other foot grasping a stone. And if the sleep was so deep that the stone fell to the ground, it would wake up the crane. And thus the crane was ever vigilant, like the Pope, in an ideal sense. St. Paul preaching in Athens, and I'm going to discuss these in the order in which they appear in the exhibition, rather than the sequence, the narrative sequence in with the biblical references, so that it's more or less a walkthrough in the exhibition. So Paul preaching in Athens tells the story not of Peter, who is the fisherman, Simon Peter, but a man who, by the name of Saul. Sometimes the conversion of Saul to Paul is simply called the conversion of Saul. But he was a Roman. He persecuted Christians. And he was at one point, and this is a tapestry that, again, it's missing. It's not in the Dresden set. The cartoon, this is one of 3 cartoons that was lost. And so the tapestries appear in the Vatican set, but not in the sets woven in Mortlake. There are only 7 cartoons and corresponding tapestries. But this lost cartoon that was the source of the tapestry, the conversion of St. Paul, shows Saul persecutor of Christians, being knocked from his horse and hearing the voice of God in the sky saying, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And that convinced Saul to convert to Christianity, becoming Paul, and one of the most powerful and active missionaries and advocates of Christianity through the Mediterranean world. And so here he is preaching to Greek non-Christians in Athens, and there's a range of listeners, some of whom seem to be believers. They're raising their hands in belief and support or conversion, whereas others seem a little skeptical. And there's one figure behind him with a red cap who bears a startling resemblance to a portrait by Raphael of Pope Leo X, who commissioned the tapestries. And I should mention that in addition to religious paintings, Raphael was also a master of portraits, and he painted mythological works as well. But at any rate, so here is Pope Leo that was included in the listeners of St. Paul that was considered a flattering homage to the Pope. And then it should also be mentioned that the building in the background very closely resembles contemporary architecture in the High Renaissance in Rome that preceded, by about a decade and a half, the creation of the tapestry cartoons. The church called the Tempietto by Bramante, the premier High Renaissance architect. And this is a groundbreaking work that took not only the decorative and formal elements of classical sculpture, but the form, the three-dimensional form of a round temple, of which there were a number from the ancient world that had been excavated or had been standing in Rome. But this one was new, and so what's old is new again, or whatnot. In the Renaissance means the rebirth of realism, the rebirth of classicism in the arts and culture. And then I should also mention that St. Paul is preaching to this pagan audience that is still have their beliefs are grounded in polytheism and beliefs in the old gods and goddesses of the Greeks and Romans. And there is a statue with his back turned, a statue of Mars that represents the pagan beliefs that are being rejected by these potential converts to Christianity. And then another scene of Paul, and this is one of these cruel scenes where there's a magician who was in the court of a city in Cyprus, the city of Paphos. Paphos, Paphos in Cyprus. This is where Paul was doing his missionary work, and he was in the process of converting a Roman governor, or he had the title proconsul, so the subtitle conversion of the proconsul. Paul was successfully converting him to Christianity, and the conversion process was interfered by this magician who was blocking the conversion of the seated governor on a throne on this platform. So the punishment was the magician was blinded. And so he's walking around, not being able to see, trying to feel his way, being shocked at the blindness. And the inscription in Latin on the platform upon which the proconsul sits reads in part, he embraces the Christian faith through the preaching of Paul, written in Latin. And this is one of a number of unanswerable questions having to do with the tapestries. This is not the original design of the tapestry. It's square, it's smaller, it's about 2/3 of the size of the other tapestries of this subject, woven from the cartoons of Raphael. And so this is a full scale from this museum in Paris, a version of the tapestry, where there's a sculpture in a niche on the right, and you have the magician in the same position, but Paul is on the right-hand side, on the other side of the throne. Here, he's on the left, behind the magician. And in the original, in the larger tapestry, it's a an anonymous person, an undefined person who's behind, but the identity is switched in order to create a more compact composition. So why did that happen? We don't know. There is, or generally, it's reject the theory that it was cut down, that this tapestry was cut down. There's no evidence. It seemed, that's the traditional interpretation, that for some unknown reason, it was just woven as a smaller tapestry with a more compact composition. That assertion has recently been challenged, but it's just an unanswerable question pending more research. And then here's the issue of the tapestry that where I had the title in blue in brackets on the list that I showed a little while ago. The subject being the death of Ananias. And this involves the a supernatural act by Peter. You could call it a miracle. It seems a very cruel miracle, where St. Peter punishes a stingy man who didn't give the wealth, the amount of money that he said he would to help the poor. And so the punishment was death. So it's the death of Ananias in the foreground, to which a friend of Ananias reacts with surprise or astonishment. And then the wife of Ananias is oblivious to what's happening, and she's still preoccupied with her money. She's counting her coins, but she will die within a short time. So it's a pretty grim story. And the reason that we have it, or that I'm talking about it, is that we were lent some wonderful works that were inspired by this tapestry. The Dresden version of the exhibition they borrowed this version of the tapestry of Ananias from the museum in the Mobilier National in Paris, the Decorative Arts Museum, knowing that they did not have their own version. And so that's another unanswerable question. Why is there no death of Ananias? And it's believed by some that there was never this seventh tapestry, that there were only 6 that were brought to Dresden. Another school of thought posits that there were originally 7 and that the death of Ananias was lost at some unknown point. So we just don't know, but we do have the benefit of having 2 plaster casts after ancient works that, again, were recently excavated, like that statue of the Tiber that Raphael certainly knew about, that inspired, they're warriors, but they inspired the poses of the dying Ananias and his astonished friend who's kneeling. And then Carol will talk about, we have 3 or 4 of these large drawings that were done, we believe, in the 19th century by a German curator and artist who did life-size black and white drawings based on the passages in the cartoons for reasons that we're not sure about. So yet that's another unanswerable question. So here's another representation of Paul and a fellow apostle Barnabas, and they're at Lystra, a city in Turkey. And Paul is visibly distressed because he performed a miracle, the healing of a lame man. The crutches are on the ground. And it was assumed by these pagans in Lystra, these non-Christians, that he and Barnabas must be gods, must be ancient gods. And there is a representation of Mercury, one of the Greek and Roman gods, Hermes to the Greeks, Mercury to the Romans. So the fact that he was considered to be a non-Christian pagan god, and that people of Lystra were ready to kill animals in sacrifice to honor who the Christian missionary who they mistook for a god, a pagan god. This made Paul so angry that he started tearing off his clothes. You know, we have the expression tearing your hair out if you're angry or upset. So he's tearing off his clothes, or in the process of starting to do that. And his agitated figure is on the right. Exhibited with this work is a an altar, a cast after an ancient Roman altar that is very similar to the altar stone in the foreground of the tapestry. Then the healing of a lame man is in that same gallery. This shows Peter, and it represents Peter's first miracle in the Temple of Jerusalem. And Peter is with the beard, and he's in the company of John, another apostle that's normally shown beardless, long-haired, and youthful. And they are healing a lame man whose legs are shown. He's unable, or he will soon be able to walk. And there is another figure on the left with crutches, or a crutch. And this takes place in the Temple of Jerusalem. And there are some babies accompanied by their mothers that are said to represent the mother's trip to the temple following their births, for the births of their children, for purification, a purification ceremony. And what's really prominent in these paintings are the spiral columns, or the twisted columns, that are said to be modeled after columns from the Temple of Jerusalem that were supposedly brought back by troops of Constantine in the 4th century CE, and were installed in the old St. Peter's that was demolished in the early 16th century for the present St. Peter's. And it turns out that nothing could be further from the truth in terms of these twisted columns being from the Temple of Jerusalem. The wrong date, the wrong country. They're Greek. They didn't come from Jerusalem, but nevertheless, they're part of the lore of St. Peter's. They're called the Solomonic columns, the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. And they were even imitated in the 17th century, where the baldachin, the canopy that marks the grave of St. Peter's by the great 17th century sculptor Bernini, he fashioned his twisted or spiral columns after these columns that were taken from old St. Peter's and installed in the new St. Peter's, or the current Renaissance St. Peter's. And then the last work in the exhibition that really, in an ideal world, would have been second right after the miraculous draft of fishes, because it's a continuation pictorially of that story that shows the recruitment of Peter while he was a fisherman. At any rate, in this tapestry, Christ is giving the keys to the kingdom of heaven to St. Peter, who becomes the first pope through that action, the keys to the kingdom of heaven. And the lore about St. Peter is that he's at the gates, the pearly gates of heaven. He has the keys to heaven. So when people want to enter heaven, they have to go through St. Peter. And so the story of the keys, although you don't see them, which I'll explain in a minute, in this Dresden tapestry. And there's also a reference to, there are quite a few passages where Christians are referred to as a flock of sheep. So Christ advises Peter to tend my lambs with my sheep, the flock on one hand, and the what's merely a gesture pointing to Peter as becoming a leader of the church, a leader of Christians in this Dresden version of the tapestry. And the pose of Christ is said to resemble that of the famous Hellenistic, or now we think it's an ancient Roman statue of Apollo, the Apollo Belvedere, although the hand is in a different position, but earlier studies show a hand raised. So again, the importance of classical art in the works of Raphael. And this is the second work where we have a life-size photo reproduction, very high quality, high resolution, exhibited near life-size. It's almost as big as the original cartoon next to the tapestry. And I haven't talked about the borders. The borders of the Dresden tapestries are different from the Vatican tapestries, but they bear the mark of a German tapestry supervisor who oversaw the weaving of the tapestries in Mortlake in England. And he was a German by birth, but his career unfolded in England, and he had an international career, but he was very important to the Mortlake tapestry works. And so this is a portrait of him, a print showing his likeness. And the borders of these tapestries are interesting. They're pretty consistent in terms of the framed, it's called a cartouche or a fancy framed shape that bears, they bear different subjects, these cartouches. And on the lower left, it's the sacrifice of Isaac in each of the tapestries, where Abraham, the Old Testament patriarch, is commanded by God to kill his son Isaac in sacrifice as a test to his faithfulness and obedience to God. And at the last minute, even though he, of course, doesn't want to kill his son, he feels obligated to, and an angel at the last minute comes to him and says, never mind. So he doesn't have to kill Isaac. And so it's an indication of God's forgiveness and mercy, but it's also looked at as a prefiguration of the sacrifice of Christ as the Son of God. And so it makes sense in this Christian context. You have this Old Testament episode. And then in other cases, there are some episodes and stories that are identifiable. For example, here's doubting Thomas after the resurrection. Some don't believe, some disciples or apostles don't believe that Christ was resurrected. So Thomas, doubting Thomas, sticks his finger in one of the wounds of Christ from the crucifixion after the resurrection, and he's convinced. So this is one of the recognizable incidents or episodes in these frames. In other cases, it doesn't seem clear what the subjects are. So there's still a lot of research that remains to be done. And then in the upper corners are figures. So we have 6 tapestries and bearded, robed men that could either be the 12 disciples or the 12 apostles, or perhaps Old Testament prophets. And there are 12 of them, which might argue in favor of 12 disciples, but again, it's unresolved. And then the difference between the Vatican and the Dresden set of tapestries is very noticeable if you compare the Vatican version of the Charge of St. Peter, where Christ, who's in a white robe that shows that he's resurrected, it's the Christ risen from the grave, the color white shows that. In the Vatican version, there are spots of gold on the white. So a desire to be more decorative and to fall more within the tradition of tapestries that had been woven up until that time, preserving traditions going back to the Middle Ages, where the aesthetic of the tapestry was to cover a flat two-dimensional surface with two-dimensional beautiful designs, two-dimensional patterns, flat patterns. And it was very difficult for, what Raphael introduced was a radical departure from traditional tapestry design. His tapestry cartoons and designs for the tapestries would have the tapestries looking more like paintings than the traditional aesthetics that the tapestry weavers and designers were used to. So we believe that there's this carryover from the reluctance to depart from the medieval traditions. So you'll notice, for example, they didn't like the blank spaces and the wide open skies and wide open receding landscapes. So they filled in the empty space with more trees and shrubs, for example. And so in one sense, it can be argued that the Dresden tapestries are truer to the cartoons than the Vatican tapestries, if you want to subscribe to that argument. And then a big difference, I already talked about the halos being missing in the Dresden tapestries, again, having been woven in London, the non-Catholic Church of England, but the keys are missing. As I already mentioned that, but here's the illustration. In the cartoon and the Vatican version, the keys to St. Peter are given, but here it's merely a gesture. And then I just show a detail to reinforce the fact that the cartoons have the halos, the Vatican tapestries do not. This is from the, or a detail showing a halo of one of the figures. And then the, finally, in the last gallery of the exhibition, we have a small space that you can walk into. And if you look on the left, you can't see it in this photograph, but we have two drawings by the hand of Raphael that represent earlier versions that predate the cartoons. So the design of the tapestries actually went through three phases. I didn't mention that there was first a so-called modello, or a preparatory study without color, where the artist experimented with various compositions. And so we have one fragment of a larger composition, parts of which have been lost, part of which is preserved in the National Gallery in Washington that they generously lent us, and the standing figure of Christ with that raised arm that's more similar to the Apollo Belvedere. This is in the Louvre, Paris. Again, the rest is lost. And then there's a second drawing with an earlier version of the miraculous drafted fishes that Carol will be talking about next week. And then finally, the programs. In addition, I've mentioned it several times, Carol Genschaft, Curator at Large, will continue looking at works that I did not cover, the works that are not tapestries or cartoons. Then there'll be a Renaissance Festival, fun for the whole family, on August 13th, Saturday from 11 to 3. Then yours truly will be talking on Saturday at 11 on August 27th. I'll be giving more of a behind the scenes view of the exhibition, the making of the exhibition. I'll show some photographs and even videos of the installation. How do we get these tapestries from Dresden to, how did we hang them in our galleries, et cetera. And then we have a lecture by an Ohio State recent PhD who wrote her dissertation on, and this is totally coincidental, on the impact of the tapestries of Raphael on subsequent tapestry design in Europe in the Renaissance and Baroque periods. So that's something to look forward to in early September. And then a concert from the series Mozart to Matisse with the Renaissance and Baroque or 19th century music. I'm not sure if the selections have been chosen yet, but that will be chamber music here in the auditorium on the 21st of September. And then the author of a recently published novel, a biography in the form of a novel of Raphael that's very readable, fascinating, by Stephanie Story. And here's her picture. Oh, there, whoops. She has already spoken as a in one of the book clubs that we did online during COVID, where she talked about this book, but she is giving a new presentation, not online, but she'll be here in person. And she is preparing a new presentation that will include material about these tapestries and how their relationship to the life and career of Raphael. She's a very lively speaker. I highly recommend that program. And then we have a great closing program near the conclusion of the exhibition on October 23rd with Anne Dumas, our British curator at large, who also works at the Houston Museum of Fine Arts. She is our adjunct curator of European art. She lives in London, so she has grown up with the cartoons of Raphael in the Victoria and Albert Museum. And there are copies of the cartoons as well in the Royal Academy of in London, where she works. Also, she's a very busy curator of working in a number of different institutions. So she'll be talking about the cult of Raphael. That the conversation is with Andrew Shelton, a professor at Ohio State, who's spoken before in the at the Columbus Museum, and he will be talking about the cult of Raphael in France and more in the 19th century. So that concludes my remarks, and it's 3:05, so I haven't gone over it too long. And thanks for listening. Thanks for coming to the museum, and I'll be happy to answer questions. Maybe. Thanks so much. If you'd like to come up individually, since we are running a little over, unless Mark, you feel any differently. Does anyone have questions online? So have a great afternoon, enjoy the exhibition, and I'll hang around in case you have any questions.